Welcome back. Here we are in the next installment here. We're going to go over a couple of the more aggressive Amethyst-based decks. We saw a quick look at the update to Ruby Amethyst and a very interesting Ruby Emerald kind of mid-range deck there in the last couple of videos. Or last video, I should say. But now we're going to see what people were kind of hyping up about. Daisy Duck is a new and prominent threat in the metagame, and it's something you have to make sure that you're prepared for, or you will just kind of get left behind. It is a very powerful card, capable of questing for a lot of lore, and hard to interact with, not only with actions, but also with characters, unless you're well prepared. So this is the deck. This is kind of one of the decks I've had built to the side. It's not a very expensive deck, money-wise. It's a, I would say, budget deck for sure. The only expensive card really in it at the moment would be Daisy Duck. And I expect it to be quite popular. We see Lilo and Maleficent finally coming back into the fray here. The one-cost, two-lore characters we've seen since set 1, and also Piglet. Piglet was a part of both winning decks in Lille and Atlanta in the first weekend of Challenge Opens, and really kind of gave us a sneak peek as to how to approach these challenges, which is being very proactive. Cards that can quest for a lot are generally ones that give your opponent the least amount of time to recover, and definitely lets you take advantage of anyone who stumbles with their deck. We kind of see here, again, this is a very, I would say, linear take on the archetype. There are slightly different versions of the deck I've seen people play around with that are way more focused on some of the bodyguards like Baloo and Donald Duck, both of which are fine. Baloo, I think a little bit less so with how I've constructed the deck in general because of its uninkability, but Donald Duck's a fine card, the 2/3 bodyguard that gives something a lore for the turn. Definitely fine cards if you want to include. This is just my take, and I think one I've had kind of sitting in my pocket there where I use to test all the decks I'm playing against with this. If it can't really fight this deck or it can't really compete, I don't really want to bring it to a tournament where I think it's going to be heavily played. And at a challenge, I certainly expect people to gravitate towards the aggression because it's time over time, again, proven that being the aggressor and presenting the questions rather than trying to answer everything is a viable strategy, unless you have all the answers and you know exactly what you're going to play against, which is hard to do at these challenges where you have to win roughly 14 out of the 18 games that you play throughout the 9 rounds. That's usually the record that's made the top cut. If anyone's wondering, you need a 77% win percentage at one of these challenges to make the second day, which is very difficult to do. That is higher than any other card game's kind of cut ratio to win losses that I've seen, and something that I think an aggressive deck can really take advantage of. Starting off here, again, we mentioned Daisy Duck, Lilo, Maleficent, and we also have some of the Ruby Amethyst mainstays in Turnbox Followers and Magic Broom. Both those cards kind of pair together well with being kind of secondary one-drops to the heavy lore questers, but also ones that can replace themselves and help you progress further into your deck to help close out the game. Pascal, set 1 favorite, making its appearance again here, paired with Maleficent and Lilo since the dawn of time. I am a big fan, if anyone's noticed, of one-cost characters in this deck. My dream with this deck is to lead on either a Daisy Duck, Lilo, Maleficent. Turn 2, play either a Piglet or a Pinocchio, the 3 lore characters essentially. And then on turn 3, play 3 more one-cost characters, deploying at least 5 lore. That's my goal. Or, a second Piglet, second Pinocchio, and then a Lilo or a Maleficent or Daisy Duck. That's the dream. You start on a 2 lore character, play a 3 lore character, and then play at least 5 lore worth of characters the following turn, emptying your hand for the most part. Now, you'll see some of the cards in this deck that aren't as aggressively costed for lore purposes. We have Daisy, Lilo, and Maleficent, Piglet, and Pinocchio, the heavy ones. Pois is in the deck. It could be the new Maleficent. It's really just there as a backup fodder. You need another cheap 2 lore character. While you can put cards that are bodyguarded in the deck, I just like having a 2-cost one because I always want to play something on that turn, either turn 2 or turn 3. I want to have as much lore to play as I can, and just being efficient if possible. The ones that are not heavy lore characters, Madam Mim Snake, really good at kind of resetting the board. Most of the characters you're going to play that cost 1 will pretty much die after you play them, except for Daisy Duck. Lilo and Maleficent are testaments to that. Having a 3-cost play where you can quest with the Lilo that's been in play, pick it up with the Mim, and then replay it kind of gives you this 3 lore for 3 ink play. Pretty helpful to get to the late game. And speaking of the late game, some of our late game cards here, Maleficent, Sven, and Merlin. Maleficent, really kind of just free card there. It doesn't really do too much functionally wise. It's there when you don't have a Chronomicon or a library going, which can happen, which we'll get to. But Maleficent always been a standby in aggressive decks. Just a body in play is always good. being able to pick it up if you need to start grinding the late game away, where you need to get more and more threats to play against someone who's trying to remove all of them, certainly helps there. And Sven functioning similarly to how I just mentioned Madam Mim doing, where instead of picking up the character and replaying it, you're just readying it so that it can't then be challenged. Of course, it can't challenge itself, but you aren't looking to do that much with this deck anyway. And of course, Merlin Goat is one of the premier cards. Any aggressive deck being a guaranteed 2 lore over the course of 2 turns is pretty astounding for a card, and making sure that the early chip damage that you're putting in there definitely counts. Some of the newer cards there, which we're going to get to here, Gather, Knowledge, and Wisdom. Really the only burn spell in Lorcana. Just gaining 2 lore, no questions asked. 2 ink, 2 lore, and there's that. That's that. One of the reasons that you can play this deck, I think, now is part of the aggressive plan, getting under the gun early, is typically thwarted by a lot of the steel decks when they get to stabilize the board, play a whole new world, and then you're kind of stuck praying for as many Merlin Goats as you can, because you know that their hand's going to be chock full of removal spells at that point, whether it be Grab Swords, Storms, Strengths, Zeus's, all that stuff, where no amount of characters you can play can really get through that barrier. What Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom does is get to kind of give you more copies of Merlin Goat. It just gains 2 lore instantly. You don't, no questions asked again. Crossing that bridge, you can be knocking the top of your deck when you're at 18 lore, even 16 lore for a couple copies of this, and just close the game out. I do like it as a finisher. It is one of the worst cards in the early game. You never want to keep it, and you're never thrilled to play it out there, and you never really want to play on turn 2. You'd almost always want to develop your early game characters before playing Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom, just to make sure that you don't have to, that you can get the value out of your characters. They do lose a little bit of their stability in play as the game goes on, and your opponent gets to play more cards like Brawl, like Be King Undisputed, if they still play that, all the steel songs that we've come to know and love, even cards like Cloud Kicker, which I expect to be picking up in play to help deal with Daisy Duck out of Emerald, all those things. But definitely a worthy inclusion there, and something I've been pretty impressed with the deck, kind of helping punish a whole new world without really seeming like it does. It definitely, makes it so that whole new world players have to be a little bit more cautious with how they use their cards, because they can certainly kill everything, but how many times can your opponent can just pay 2, gain 2? Speaking of churning through your deck and seeing a lot of cards there, we had the last 2 cards kind of rounding out the deck. Amethyst Chronomicon, one of the worst cards possible in the aggressive mirror match, I will say. It is very poor into other copies of this kind of deck, or any other deck that's using, I would say, Piglet, or really kind of going fast in that manner. It is not good when you're both drawing cards, and if you're to play a mirror match of this deck, one of the worst cards you could probably play is Amethyst Chronomicon, because your opponent's cards are as efficient as yours. What it does for this deck is kind of help you keep up with card flow, or maybe stockpile a turn. You can play several characters all at once and really have them have to have a mass removal effect in Be Prepared or Grab Your Swords, rather than be able to use pinpoint removal to answer just a couple of threats at a time. Helps kind of dig through your deck, play out a bunch of threats, find more Merlins, find Gathering Knowledge, play out a bunch of threats all at once. It does it all, and it's pretty efficient at what it does. It is inkable, again, in cases where I mentioned earlier, where it's very poor into a lot of the removal-based decks, a lot of the other aggressive decks. It does help against the removal decks. And rounding it out again here, we see copies of the Library, very similar to Amethyst Chronomicon in that sense. The Library allows you to kind of recoup when your opponent is singing songs to then kill all your characters, and its passive lore gain of 1 is nothing to scoff at. 8 willpower is a ton for most decks to deal with, and they're going to be busy enough challenging your characters, trying to keep up with you in that sense, for them to really go into and commit 8 strength to the Library most of the time. Anything you then can pick up after the fact and use to kind of cross the finish line, more than a welcome addition to the deck, and I've been happy with it. It wasn't initially in my inclusion. I kind of shaved some of the numbers. You see the 3s, you see Pois, Maleficent, Sven. Those became 3 copies of the Library just because of how good that was, and how kind of medium the Maleficents and Pois were. Sven's very good, but having too many high cost cards, I was really trying to keep it under 2 or under. As you can see for this particular deck, there are only 13 cards that cost more than 2 in the deck. Again, you're really trying to maximize the ability for you to play a 1-cost character, 2 2-cost characters, or a 2-cost character, 2 1-cost characters, a 2-cost character, and then on turn 3 play 3 1s, or play 5 lore between Pinocchio and one of the other 2s. As much lore as you can play is the name of the game, and it's something that does it very efficiently, I will say. I would recommend it. I would recommend, if you can, and you're just practicing, making sure you always have a copy of this deck handy, making sure you always have it kind of the litmus test for the format. Can you beat this deck? Do you have a chance? Do you think people are going to play this deck, or should you be playing it yourself? It's a good test, and definitely it's something worth trying out as well for competitive sake. we're going to take a look here into another Amethyst favorite, and it is going to be one of my favorites, Amethyst Steel. Amethyst Steel has been, on paper, I would say, the best looking deck in every format since the dawn of time. It looks very good, but it always has some problems where it's not as efficient as it should be. Some things a little bit more snowball-y, but it has answers for everything, and it has the ability to draw cards, go into the late game, reuse its threats, and really present very hard to deal with questions at the time. We do take a look here, and we see the usual suspects: Merlin Crab, Merlin Groat, and Merlin Merlin Rabbit, Merlin Goat, Merlin Crab, Mim Fox, and Mim Snake. Those kind of, I would say, 20 cards or so. The Amethyst package are pretty much staples, along with Friends on the Other Side, for almost every Amethyst deck I've tried. I've tried building decks without them, and they just never seem to be doing what I really want them to do. But here we paired those cards with Steel. Some of the main reasons to be Steel, and one of the ones I want to highlight starting in this deck, we'll see again in many future decks, is Pete, the game referee. The 3-cost 3/3 that stops your opponent from playing actions. Now, this card can be a complete nightmare for some decks. Steel Song in particular, as well as Ruby Amethyst, and any kind of Ruby deck using Be Prepared to help clear the board. You get to play a card that says you can't do it. I don't care if you had it in your hand. I don't care if you draw another one. You just can't. It is a huge tempo swing that, especially with all the bounce effects I just mentioned, being able to reuse Pete kind of gives this deck the name Repeat. Being able to do it more than once and over and over and over again until the dawn, of the next game, really. Being able to utilize Pete is something that I think some decks need to take into consideration when they're deck building themselves. A lot of times you're going to see people with less reliance on cards like either Grab Your Swords or even Let It Go. Maybe go for cards like Hades. Out of any kind of control deck, you want more character-based challenge effects to help answer the board rather than just actions, because they are pretty vulnerable to Pete. Pete is a scary card, and it's really hard to deal with at times without any kind of actions. And if they don't use it to quest, it's really hard to kill. One of the other things this deck takes advantage of is Cogsworth. Cogsworth pairing with Robin Hood, with Captain Hook, and specifically with Tinkerbell Giant Fairy. On 7 ink, yes, I know it's a lot, but being able to play a Tinkerbell and rush a Tinkerbell has been fantastic. It is really hard for many people to play around that, and it's not that hard to set up. There's enough card draw in this deck between Friends on the Other Side, Merlin Rabbit, and Queen's Castle where you're not unlikely to hit that much ink into mid to late game, assuming, of course, any kind of whole new world shenanigans doesn't give you a surplus of ink, which in case the card draw doesn't matter as much. But Cogsworth plus Tinkerbell has been absolutely fantastic. And one of the other things to note with this deck, Cogsworth plus the 5-cost Robin Hood, when you don't have a 1-cost Robin Hood in play, gives you the ability to gain lore kind of out of nowhere with rushed Robin Hood. All the other cards we see in this deck are pretty standard. We have Smee and Captain Hook to kind of be aggressive and kind of check those daisies, which I talked about. Daisy is a problem for a lot of decks, but not really this one. We see the copies of Merlin Crab, Mim Fox, and even something as simple as if they go turn 1 Daisy, you play a Robin Hood or Captain Hook. They think they're safe with the quest there because you can only hit for 2, but then you play another 1-cost either Hood or Hook, and then play Cogsworth, and then just rush that one in. And then you have 2 Robin Hoods and a Cogsworth to their dead Daisy. Really aggressive and can kind of take either role. We do see here one of the newer cards as well, Elsa, the 5th Spirit. The 2/5 with Rush, Evasive, and the ability to exert an opposing character really gives you some control of the game. This is the kind of deck that might enjoy the Pinocchio that exerts an opposing character that costs 2 and you're able to bounce with, but I prefer the Ink ability. Also, it is this deck's primary answer outside of Along Came Zeus to a card like Diablo. While a little bit expensive, sure, it is an answer, and I think that people have moved away from Diablo just a little bit because Diablo, while it's great to draw a bunch of cards and all, isn't the best actually at dealing with Daisy Duck, and that might be a more prominent threat in this format than it was prior. Rounding out the rest of the deck, we have Queen's Castle, Along Came Zeus, Friends on the Other Side, some usual culprits there from the Amethyst Steel package, and I mentioned the Bounce package, of course, but one of the big strengths you'll see here, Pete, game referee, being able to be recursive with it. You never really know the impact until you're sitting across from it. I will say, it's hard to know that you did something right or how good it was in a certain situation, unless your opponent A, shows your hand, or B, you're on the receiving end, then you feel like you're just kind of paralyzed from that point onward, and it can be really backbreaking just timing the Petes correctly. Putting off on a key turn where they can be using it to, sing songs and then being able to pick it up again after questing and then play it once more to then stop them from Be Prepareding is really too much for a lot of decks to answer. And something I think that this deck is going to be well known for is its ability to lock people out of the game. While there's no copies of Arthur, the 1/3 from set 2 that returns a character to your hand to technically go infinite with Pete, you do have, functionally, once you found one Pete, you functionally have 11 Pete in total between the Mim Fox and the Mim Snakes. So time it wisely, and this deck can absolutely demolish an opposing player who's relying on actions to answer things. And Pete is a game changer for sure. It is still my vote for the best card in the set, hands down. I know Daisy Duck is something we all have to be aware of, but Pete, I believe over time will show as much value as 2-cost Ursula taking songs, or even more so to that degree. But thanks again for tuning into this video. Join me again here in the next installment here through the video series. We're going to go a few more decks. We have about 6 or 7 more to go. There's going to be a point here where I go through all the different Steel Song or Amber Steel variants here, usually towards the end, but we'll take a look here, and thanks again for tuning in. See you next time.